Listen, if you'd told Daniel 3 months ago that he'd be making the worst decision of his life at 2:30 in the morning on a freezing space station while holding a mop, he would have believed you. That's just how his life went. What he wouldn't have believed. The decision would involve a baby apex predator and his only decent blanket. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Station Quintara 6 was one of those diplomatic hubs that looked impressive in the recruitment brochures. Gleaming corridors, species from across the galaxy, mingling in peaceful cooperation. The promise of being part of something bigger than yourself. What the brochures didn't mention was that somebody had to clean up after all that peaceful cooperation, and that somebody was Daniel. 38 cycles old, perpetually exhausted, and possessed of exactly 0 diplomatic aspirations, Daniel had somehow ended up as a night shift janitor in a place where treaties got signed 3 decks above his head, while he scrubbed mysterious alien food stains off the floor panels. The pay was mediocre, the hours were brutal, and his supervisors treated him like a piece of mobile furniture that occasionally needed new batteries. Tonight was especially fun because the environmental systems in the maintenance sectors had gone haywire again. Budget cuts, they said. Necessary resource reallocation, they said. What they meant was, the important people stay warm, and the janitors can freeze. Daniel pushed his maintenance cart down the lower observation deck, breath misting in front of his face, and seriously questioned his life choices. Again. The observation deck was supposed to be this grand viewing area where dignitaries could gaze at the stars and feel philosophical about the cosmos. In reality, it had been converted into overflow storage about 6 months ago, and now it was Daniel's job to make sure the forgotten junk looked presentably forgotten. He was halfway through mopping a section of floor that had accumulated some kind of purple residue. He'd learned not to ask questions when he heard it. A sound, small, pathetic, and absolutely not supposed to be there. Daniel stopped, mop suspended in midair, and listened. There it was again, a sort of whimpering, mewling, the universal sound of something tiny and miserable, which was honestly the last thing he needed tonight. Not my problem, he muttered to himself, dunking the mop back in the bucket. I clean floors. I don't investigate mysterious space noises. That's how people die in horror vids. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Daniel sighed the sigh of a man who knew he was about to do something stupid and closed his eyes. Fantastic. Just fantastic. He followed the sound to a corner of the deck, behind a stack of cargo containers that probably hadn't been moved since the station was built. And there, wedged into a gap between 2 containers and shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, was the single most ridiculous thing Daniel had ever seen. A Quellan cub. Now, for those not familiar with galactic politics and the various species trying not to kill each other in the name of diplomacy, Quellans occupied a special place in the collective imagination. They were apex predators, the kind of species that made other species nervous just by existing. Adults stood over 2 meters tall, possessed claws that could slice through starship hull plating, had night vision that made darkness irrelevant, and hunting instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. They were, in short, terrifying. This cub was about the size of a house cat. It had dark fur covered in bioluminescent stripes that flickered weakly in the dim light, enormous eyes that took up half its face, and a little button nose that would have been adorable if Daniel didn't know those tiny fangs would eventually grow into weapons. Currently, Those fangs were chattering, and the cub was trembling so violently that Daniel could see it from 3 meters away. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Daniel said to the universe at large. "A Quellan cub? Here? How does a baby apex predator end up in storage?" The cub's enormous eyes locked onto him, and it made a sound that was somehow both pitiful and accusatory, as if Daniel was personally responsible for its predicament. "Don't look at me like that," Daniel said, pointing his mop at the creature. "I don't do childcare. I barely manage to keep myself alive. And you're a future death machine. Your species has a reputation." The cub shivered harder and made a sound like a broken squeak toy. Daniel felt something in his chest do a traitorous little flip. "No," he told himself firmly. "Absolutely not. This is not your problem. There's a Quellan delegation on station right now. This is obviously their cub. They're probably looking for it. Security will handle this. You have floors to mop." He turned to leave. The cub whimpered. Daniel made it exactly 5 steps before his conscience, that useless vestigial organ that had caused him nothing but trouble his entire life, kicked in with both feet. "This is the worst idea you've ever had," he informed himself, turning back around. "And you once tried to repair a plasma conduit with electrical tape." The cub watched him approach with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Up close, Daniel could see just how cold it was. The bioluminescent stripes were barely glowing. Its tiny body was curled into the smallest possible ball, and there was frost forming on its whiskers. Whatever had led to this situation, the cub had been here for a while. "Okay," Daniel said, crouching down slowly. "Here's the deal, Buttons." The cub tilted its head. "Yeah, I'm calling you Buttons. Because that nose is ridiculous and I need to call you something. Now, I'm going to pick you up, and you're not going to bite me, claw me, or do any of the things your species is famous for. Deal?" Buttons responded by trying to hiss, which came out as more of a squeaky cough. "Terrifying," Daniel said dryly. "I'm shaking." He reached out slowly, half expecting those tiny claws to shred his hand. Buttons made a half-hearted attempt to bite him. Fangs that would one day tear through armor currently couldn't pierce the fabric of Daniel's work gloves, and then gave up, too cold and miserable to put up a real fight. Daniel scooped the cub up carefully. It weighed almost nothing, just a tiny ball of freezing fur and indignation. Buttons struggled for about 2 seconds, then seemed to realize that Daniel was significantly warmer than the floor and went limp against his chest. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Daniel muttered, feeling the cub's rapid heartbeat against his palm. "You're all talk." Now came the real problem. Daniel looked down at his maintenance cart, calculating his options. He could try to find the Quellan delegation, but it was the middle of the night shift, and the diplomatic quarters were halfway across the station. By the time he got there, Buttons might be a tiny, furry popsicle. He could call security, but they were useless at the best of times, and explaining this situation would take forever. Or, Daniel looked at his thermal blanket, the worn gray rectangle folded on the bottom shelf of his cart. It was the one thing that made these freezing night shifts bearable. The one piece of equipment he'd bought with his own credits because station issue was garbage. His blanket, his warmth, his only defense against hypothermia while cleaning floors for people who didn't know his name. "I'm going to regret this," Daniel said, reaching for the blanket. He spread it out on top of a cargo container, then carefully placed Buttons in the center. The cub's eyes went wide. The blanket was still warm from being near Daniel for the last few hours, and the change in temperature was probably a shock to its tiny system. Daniel wrapped the cub up burrito style, leaving just its face poking out. For a moment, Buttons just stared at him with those enormous eyes, as if trying to process what was happening. Then, slowly, the shivering began to decrease. The bioluminescent stripes started glowing brighter, and the cub made a sound that was almost like purring. "Don't get attached," Daniel warned, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cub or himself. "This is temporary. I'm going to find your family, and then we're done. You'll go back to being a terrifying predator in training, and I'll go back to mopping floors and questioning my life choices." Buttons blinked slowly and snuggled deeper into the blanket. Daniel's heart did another one of those traitorous flips. "Fantastic," he muttered. "I've been adopted by a future apex predator. This is fine. Everything is fine." He pulled out his work tablet and tried to access the station directory. The Quellan delegation was listed, Ambassador Kolneth and his entourage here for trade negotiations, but all their contact information was locked behind administrative access that Daniel definitely didn't have. He tried the security channel, but the overnight AI just gave him automated responses about filing proper incident reports. "Useless," Daniel said, glaring at the tablet. "Absolutely useless. I could have a plasma fire and a hull breach, and this thing would tell me to file a form." He looked back at Buttons, who was now watching him with what might have been curiosity, those big eyes tracking his movements. "Okay, new plan," Daniel said. "You're going to stay here where it's relatively warm. I'm going to finish my shift because I need this job. And in the morning, when the competent people wake up, we'll sort this out. Sound good?" Buttons made a little chirping sound. "I'll take that as agreement." Daniel fashioned a makeshift nest in a storage alcove, using some packing material he found to create a windbreak and placing the blanket-wrapped cub in the center. Buttons protested when Daniel tried to leave, making increasingly pathetic noises, but eventually settled down when Daniel promised he'd be nearby. "I can't believe I'm negotiating with a baby," Daniel said, returning to his cart. "This is what my life has become." He continued his shift, mopping floors and emptying waste receptacles and doing all the other glamorous tasks that came with keeping a space station running. But he kept checking on Buttons every 20 minutes, just to make sure the cub was still breathing. Each time, he found those big eyes watching him from the blanket nest, and each time he told himself he was absolutely not getting emotionally invested in a creature that could probably snap his spine like a twig once it grew up. By the time his shift ended at 0600, Daniel had almost convinced himself that the whole thing would resolve itself. He'd leave a note for the day shift. Someone would contact the Quellan delegation, and Buttons would be reunited with its family. Simple. Clean. No complications. He should have known better. As Daniel was gathering his things, preparing to head back to his quarters for some desperately needed sleep, the observation deck doors slid open, and through them walked the single most intimidating individual Daniel had ever seen. Ambassador Kolneth stood easily 2.5 meters tall, with midnight black fur and bioluminescent stripes that glowed a deep, angry red. His claws, actual, visible claws, gleamed in the station lighting, and his eyes, golden and predatory, swept the room with the kind of focus that made prey animals freeze in terror. Behind him came a security team, a flustered-looking station administrator, and 3 more adult Quellans, all looking equally imposing. Daniel, holding his mop and standing next to a storage alcove containing a stolen Quellan cub wrapped in his blanket, had exactly one thought: "I'm going to die." The ambassador's eyes locked onto him, then flicked to the alcove, where Buttons had apparently heard the new arrivals and was making excited, chirping sounds. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Ambassador Kolneth spoke, his voice a deep rumble that Daniel felt in his chest. You have found our cub. Daniel's mouth, that traitorous organ that had gotten him in trouble almost as much as his conscience, opened before his brain could stop it. Yeah, about that, he said. In my defense, the kid was freezing. Your people were impossible to contact at 3 in the morning, and station security is about as useful as a screen door on a spaceship. So I improvised. You're welcome, by the way. The security team looked horrified. The administrator went pale. The other Quellans tensed. And Ambassador Kolneth smiled. It was not a comforting expression. Here's the thing about being exhausted, underpaid, and running on approximately 12 hours of accumulated sleep over the past 3 days. Your sense of self-preservation gets a little fuzzy around the edges, which was the only explanation for why Daniel was currently sassing an alien ambassador who could probably rip him in half without breaking a sweat. The smile on Kolneth's face was the kind predators gave right before they pounced. His golden eyes, which had been scanning the room with military precision, now focused entirely on Daniel with an intensity that made the janitor's survival instincts finally wake up and start screaming. You improvised, Kolneth repeated slowly, each word precise and measured. Yeah, Daniel said, because apparently his mouth hadn't gotten the memo about imminent death. Improvised. You know, made a decision based on available resources and the immediate situation. It's this thing humans do when bureaucracy fails, which, let me tell you, happens a lot on this station. The security team leader, a Trill named, actually, Daniel had no idea what her name was, took a step forward. Ambassador, we can handle this situation. This employee will be disciplined for... Kolneth raised one clawed hand, and the security leader stopped mid-sentence. The ambassador's attention never left Daniel. You gave the cub your blanket. It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered anyway. Well, yeah, kid was freezing. What was I supposed to do? Let it turn into a popsicle? That seemed like a bad diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Human janitor allows ambassador's kid to freeze to death. Makes for terrible headlines. From the alcove, Buttons let out an excited series of chirps and began struggling out of the blanket nest, tiny claws scrambling for purchase. One of the Quellans behind Kolneth, a female with silver-gray fur, rushed forward and scooped up the cub. Buttons immediately began nuzzling against her, making those purring sounds again, but kept looking back at Daniel with those enormous eyes. Kumi has been missing for 6 hours, Kolneth said, and something in his voice had shifted. The predatory edge was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded almost like relief. We searched the diplomatic quarters, the conference halls, the recreational areas. It never occurred to us to search the maintenance sectors. Yeah, well, Daniel said, suddenly feeling awkward under that intense golden stare. Kids wander. It happens. The important thing is Buttons, Kumi, is okay. Buttons? The silver-gray Quellan looked up, cradling Kumi carefully. Daniel felt his face heat. The nose. The nose looked like a button. I needed to call the kid something. There was a moment of silence. Then, to Daniel's complete shock, Kolneth laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating. Buttons, my daughter, heir to the Quellan northern clans, warrior bloodline stretching back 3,000 cycles. Buttons. In my defense, Daniel said quickly, I didn't know about the air thing. I just knew about the freezing thing, and the tiny thing, and the button nose thing. Kolneth's laughter faded, but the smile remained, and this time it looked almost genuine. He took a step closer to Daniel, and the janitor fought the urge to step back. The ambassador was massive up close, all muscle and barely contained power, and those claws looked even sharper at this distance. "You wrapped her in your own thermal blanket," Kalneth said softly. "In the middle of your shift, in a station where the maintenance sectors are kept deliberately cold. You sacrificed your own comfort for a child of a species you did not know." "I mean, it seemed like the obvious thing to do," Daniel said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Look, I'm just a janitor, okay? I clean floors. I found a cold kid. I made the kid warm. That's it. That's the whole story. Can I have my blanket back now? Because I've got another shift tonight, and I'd really prefer not to freeze." The administrator, who'd been silent up until now, finally found his voice. "Ambassador, I assure you this employee will be reprimanded for accessing areas without proper authorization and for interfering with—" "Interfering?" Kalneth turned to look at the administrator, and the man went pale. "This human protected my daughter when my own delegation could not find her. He showed honor in a moment when he had nothing to gain and much to risk. You will speak of reprimands again, and we will have a very different conversation." The administrator stammered something unintelligible and retreated. Daniel blinked. Thanks? I think." Kalneth turned back to him, and there was something calculating in those golden eyes now. "You know of Quellans, yes? Our reputation? Big, scary, apex predators, excellent hunters. Don't mess with them unless you want to become a statistic," Daniel rattled off. "Yeah, I've heard the stories, which made finding buttons extra fun, let me tell you. My brain was running all these calculations about how to explain either hypothermia or mauling scars to my supervisor. And yet, you helped her anyway. What can I say? I make poor life choices. It's kind of my thing." The silver-gray Quellan approached, still holding Kumi, who was now reaching toward Daniel with tiny paws. "I am Kalshen, Kumi's mother. You have our gratitude, human. What is your name?" "Daniel," he said, eyeing the cub's outstretched paws warily. "Just Daniel. No fancy titles, no diplomatic immunity, just a guy with a mop who apparently has a soft spot for freezing kids." "Daniel," Kalneth repeated, as if testing the name. "You have shown my clan honor. Among my people, actions speak louder than words. You acted without hesitation to protect a vulnerable cub. This is remembered." Something about the way he said "remembered" made Daniel's skin prickle. "That's great. Really. But I've been on shift for 9 hours. I'm running on coffee fumes and questionable life choices, and I really need to sleep. So, if we're done here?" Kalneth reached into his diplomatic robes and pulled out the thermal blanket. He held it for a moment, running one claw gently over the worn fabric, then handed it back to Daniel. "Keep it. We will provide you with better equipment. You have earned that much." "I don't need—" "You have earned it," Kalneth repeated more firmly. Then he added something that made Daniel's stomach drop. "The cubs will remember." "The cubs?" Daniel took the blanket, frowning. "What cubs? There's more than one?" Kalshen smiled, and it was somehow both warm and terrifying. "Quimi has 2 siblings. They are very close. What one experiences, the others share." "Okay," Daniel said slowly, not liking where this was going. "And that means?" "It means," Kalneth said, "that you may have made a larger impression than you realize. But we shall see. Rest well, Daniel the janitor. I suspect our paths will cross again." With that cryptic statement, the Quellan delegation swept out of the observation deck, taking Quimi with them. Daniel stood alone among the storage containers, clutching his blanket, and feeling like he'd just survived something significant, but couldn't quite figure out what. "The cubs will remember," he muttered to himself. "What kind of ominous nonsense is that?" He trudged back to his quarters, which were exactly as cramped and depressing as he'd left them. Station housing for maintenance workers was minimal. A bed, a small desk, a storage locker, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. The walls were gray, the floor was gray, and the ceiling was also gray, because apparently whoever designed these quarters believed in committing to a theme. Daniel collapsed onto his bed without bothering to change out of his work uniform. His last thought, before exhaustion claimed him, was that at least the Quellen situation was resolved. He'd probably never see Kwame again. The delegation would finish their negotiations and leave, and life would return to its normal, boring, floor-mopping routine. He really should have known better. 8 hours later, Daniel woke up to his alarm screaming at him that his next shift was starting in 30 minutes. He groaned, dragged himself through a shower that was somehow both scalding hot and freezing cold at the same time. Station plumbing was a mystery he'd given up trying to solve, and stumbled out of his quarters while still trying to button his uniform, and stopped dead. Outside his door, arranged in a neat semicircle, were 3 Quellen cubs. Kwame, Buttons, sat in the center, her bioluminescent stripes glowing a cheerful blue. To her left was a slightly larger cub with darker fur and green-tinted stripes. To her right was another cub, this one with lighter gray fur and stripes that flickered between purple and gold. All 3 were staring at him. "No," Daniel said out loud. "Absolutely not. This is not happening." Buttons chirped happily. "You have a family," Daniel continued, pointing at the cubs as if they could understand him. "A very important, very diplomatic family. You should be with them, not outside my quarters. This is not a thing that should be happening." The darker cub tilted its head, considering this argument. Then it chirped too. "Oh, fantastic. You've recruited reinforcements." Daniel looked around the corridor, hoping to see a handler, a delegation member, someone who could explain this situation. The hallway was empty except for one of his fellow maintenance workers, a Brenthian named, well, Daniel called him Blue Guy, because Brenthian names were unpronounceable. Blue Guy took one look at the scene, both eye stalks widening in what might have been horror or amusement, and quickly scurried away. "Helpful," Daniel called after him. "Really helpful. Thanks for nothing." He turned back to the cubs. "Okay, listen, I have a shift. I need to go to work. You need to go wherever baby apex predators go. Probably somewhere that involves learning to hunt or practicing being terrifying or whatever it is your people do." The lighter gray cub yawned, showing tiny fangs, and curled up into a ball. "Are you sleeping? Outside my door? Why are you sleeping outside my door?" Button stood up, padded over to Daniel's leg, and rubbed against it, purring. Daniel's heart, that traitorous organ, melted a little. "This is a terrible idea," he told himself firmly. "They're predators. Baby predators are still predators. This is going to end badly." But even as he said it, he found himself reaching down to gently scratch behind Buttons' ears. The cub's purr intensified, and the other 2 cubs immediately perked up, apparently deciding that if Buttons was getting attention, they wanted in on it too. Within seconds, Daniel was surrounded by 3 purring, nuzzling Quellen cubs, and his resolve was crumbling faster than station infrastructure during budget cuts. "I'm going to regret this," he muttered. "I'm going to regret this so much." He gently extracted himself from the cub pile and headed toward the maintenance department, hoping they'd get bored and wander off. They didn't wander off. They followed him. At a respectful distance, sure, with two exhausted-looking Quellen handlers trailing behind them and making apologetic gestures at Daniel. But they followed, all the way to the maintenance department, where Bryn, his supervisor, took one look at the situation and burst out laughing. Bryn was a human woman in her 50s, tough as recycled steel, and possessed of exactly zero patience for nonsense. She'd been working on Station Quintara 6 since before Daniel was born, and she'd seen everything, or so she claimed. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Daniel, what did you do?" "I gave a cold kid a blanket," Daniel protested. "That's it. That's the entire story. And now apparently I'm being haunted by baby apex predators." One of the handlers, a young Quellen male who looked barely older than the cubs, approached nervously. "Apologies, human Daniel. The cubs, they refused to leave. We have tried to relocate them to the delegation quarters, but they return here. They seem to have imprinted." "Imprinted," Daniel repeated flatly. "What does that mean, imprinted?" "In Quellen culture," the handler explained, "cubs form what we call safety bonds with adults who protect them during vulnerable moments. You wrapped Kumi in your blanket when she was cold and frightened. You became part of her safety circle. And because cubs share experiences telepathically during their early development stages, her siblings now share that bond." Daniel stared at the handler, then at the cubs, who were sitting in a neat row, watching him with those enormous eyes. Then at Bryn, who was still grinning like this was the most entertaining thing she'd seen in years. "So you're telling me," Daniel said slowly, "that I accidentally made 3 future apex predators think of me as, what, their protector?" "Essentially, yes," the handler said. "It will fade as they mature, but for now, they feel safest near you. Quellen cubs are stubborn about these things." "Stubborn," Daniel repeated. "Great. Fantastic. Because that's exactly what I needed in my life right now." Bryn clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, congratulations, Daniel. You're the only human I know who accidentally adopted alien predators. Don't put them on your overtime forms, and try not to let them eat any of the diplomats." "This is not funny," Daniel said. "It's hilarious," Bryn corrected. "Now, get to work. Those floors won't mop themselves. And if your entourage causes any problems, that's on you." Daniel looked at the cubs, who gazed back with expressions of complete innocence. "This is going to be the weirdest shift of my life," he muttered. He had no idea how right he was. Turns out, having 3 Quellen cubs as your unofficial entourage changed station dynamics in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated. For starters, the usual troublemakers who made his job difficult? Gone. Vanished. Evaporated like moisture in a vacuum. The drunk. Vecchian traders who normally threw up in the corridors and left Daniel to clean it? Suddenly very interested in making it back to their quarters without incident. The group of teenage Trill who liked to vandalize the lower decks? Found other hobbies? Nobody wanted to cause problems when 3 baby apex predators were watching? "This is the weirdest security system ever," Daniel muttered, mopping a section of corridor that was actually clean for once. Behind him, Kumi, Kusi, and Kuven sat in their usual formation, watching his every move with those enormous, unblinking eyes. The handlers had given up trying to relocate them after the 3rd day. Now they just followed Daniel's shifts, making sure the cubs didn't get into actual trouble and looking perpetually exhausted. Daniel sympathized. He was also perpetually exhausted, but at least he got paid for it. The weird part, and there were many weird parts, was how the cubs behaved around him. They didn't demand attention, didn't get in his way, just stayed close, like tiny, furry, bioluminescent bodyguards who occasionally needed to be reminded that plasma conduits were not toys. "You know what's really messed up?" Daniel said to Bryn during one of their overlap shifts. "I'm getting used to this. That's concerning, right? That should concern me." Bryn, who was reviewing maintenance schedules on her tablet, smirked. "You've always been weird, Daniel. This is just confirmation." "Thanks. Really feeling the support here." "Hey, look on the bright side," she said, gesturing around the unusually clean corridor. "Your sectors have never looked better. Petty crime is down 60% in areas you cover. And," she added with a grin, "the Quellen delegation has been asking about you." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Asking what, exactly?" "How you're doing, how the cubs are behaving, whether you need anything." Bryn's grin widened. "I think you've made an impression, Daniel. A big, interspecies, potentially life-changing impression." "I gave a kid a blanket," Daniel protested weakly. "That's it. That's all I did." "Yeah, well, tell that to your fan club." As if on cue, Buttons, Daniel had given up trying to call her Kwame, chirped happily and padded over to rub against his leg. The other two cubs followed, creating a small pile of purring predators around his feet. "See?" Bryn said. "Adorable. Terrifying, but adorable." Daniel was about to respond when his tablet buzzed with an urgent maintenance alert. He pulled it out, frowning at the screen. "Huh. That's weird." "What?" "Environmental Systems Alert in subsection 9. That's near the diplomatic conference rooms." He scrolled through the data, his frown deepening. "But the readings don't make sense. Temperature fluctuations, minor pressure changes. It's like someone's tampering with the systems. But why would?" The cubs suddenly went rigid. All three of them, simultaneously. Their bioluminescent stripes flickered from calm blues and greens to sharp, aggressive reds. Their ears flattened against their heads, and they made a sound Daniel had never heard before, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating. "Okay," Daniel said slowly, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. "That's new. That's a new behavior. Bryn, have you ever seen them do that?" Bryn had gone pale, her hand already reaching for her communicator. "No, and I don't like it. Quellens don't spook easily. If the cubs are reacting like that—" Buttons suddenly bolted down the corridor, her siblings close behind. The handlers yelped and gave chase, shouting in their own language. Daniel didn't think. He just ran. His janitor instincts, honed from cycles of knowing every inch of this station's maintenance systems, told him exactly where the cubs were heading. Subsection 9. The environmental alert. The weird readings. "Daniel, wait!" Bryn called after him, but he was already gone. He caught up to the cubs at a maintenance shaft that should have been sealed, should have been locked, should have been impossible to access without proper authorization codes. The access panel was open, and inside, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, Daniel could see movement. Figures, at least 3 of them, working on the environmental control junction with equipment that definitely wasn't standard station issue. The cubs positioned themselves between Daniel and the shaft, no longer playful. Their tiny bodies had gone into hunting stances, low, coiled, ready to strike. Even as youngsters, even barely past infancy, their predator instincts were activating. Daniel's mouth went dry, because he recognized the species inside that shaft. Nelloc traders, insectoid, calculating, and currently doing something very illegal to the station's environmental systems. One of them noticed Daniel. Compound eyes reflected the cub's bioluminescent glow. Just a janitor, it clicked to its companions in standard. And some cubs, no threat. Daniel felt something inside him shift. That same stupid, reckless instinct that had made him give Buttons his blanket. That made him care about things he had no business caring about. "You know what?" he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "You're right. I am just a janitor, which means I know every inch of this station's systems, including the fact that what you're doing will cause a cascade failure that'll evacuate 3 decks and disrupt every negotiation currently happening." He pulled out his tablet, fingers flying across the screen. "It also means I know exactly which alarm to trigger. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step away from that junction, and we're going to have a nice conversation with security. Or," he gestured to the cubs, whose growls had intensified, "or you can find out why apex predators earned their reputation. Your choice." The Nelloc inside the shaft exchanged glances, and Daniel, exhausted, Janitor armed with nothing but a mop, a tablet, and 3 very angry baby predators, waited to see if his bluff would work. Turns out, having a reputation as the guy who befriended Quellens had its advantages. The Nellocs chose wisely. The aftermath of catching Nelloc saboteurs red-handed while armed with only a mop and 3 baby predators was, in Daniel's opinion, significantly more annoying than the actual confrontation. First came the security debriefing, which took 6 hours and involved explaining the same story to increasingly skeptical officials who couldn't seem to wrap their heads around the concept of a janitor stopping an interstellar incident. Then came the diplomatic fallout, which involved a lot of angry Nelloc representatives claiming their traders were merely conducting routine inspections until the evidence of sabotage equipment became too overwhelming to deny. Through it all, the cubs stayed by Daniel's side. When a particularly aggressive Nelloc delegate got too close, Kusi, the darker-furred cub with green stripes, had positioned himself between them and made a sound that suggested he was already practicing his intimidation tactics. The delegate backed off quickly. "You know," Daniel said to the cubs during a break in the proceedings, "you guys are way more effective than security. Has anyone mentioned that? Because they should really put that in the station brochures." Buttons chirped and nuzzled his hand. It was during hour 8 of the whole mess that Ambassador Kolneth finally showed up, sweeping into the security office with the kind of presence that made everyone straighten their spines involuntarily. He listened to the security chief's report, his golden eyes never leaving Daniel, and then did something unexpected. He smiled. "So," Kolneth said, his deep voice filling the room, "the human janitor who gave his blanket to a cold cub has now prevented a sabotage that would have collapsed our trade negotiations and potentially caused significant casualties." "I really just wanted to finish my shift," Daniel said tiredly. "The whole hero thing was accidental. Again." "Accidental," Kolneth repeated, that smile widening. "You continue to be interesting, Daniel. My cubs certainly think so." "About that," Daniel started, but Kolneth raised a clawed hand. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Daniel found himself following the ambassador out of the security office, the cubs trailing behind, their handlers looking both exhausted and resigned. They walked through the diplomatic sectors, areas Daniel normally only saw while mopping, until they reached an observation deck. This one actually functioned as intended, with massive viewports showing the swirling nebula that Station Quintara 6 orbited. "You are aware," Kolneth said, gazing out at the stars, "that Quellens have a reputation across the galaxy. Terrifying apex predators. Yeah, I've heard," Daniel said, "although your kids kind of undermine that image. They're more like oversized house cats who purr when you scratch their ears." Kolneth's laugh was genuine. "They will grow into their reputation, I assure you. But you have touched on something important. Our reputation precedes us. Other species see us as threats, as dangers to be managed and contained. It makes integration into galactic society difficult. He turned to look at Daniel directly. And then a human janitor wraps my freezing daughter in his only blanket, asks nothing in return, and treats her with kindness, despite knowing what her species is capable of. Do you understand what that means to us? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. That I make poor life choices? That you see past reputation to need? That you acted on compassion, without calculation? Collineth's expression grew serious. We came to this station to negotiate trade agreements. Yes, but also to prove that Quellans can be trusted partners. Your actions, small as you believe them to be, have done more for that goal than months of diplomatic discussions. I'm still just a janitor, Daniel protested. I clean floors. I'm not a diplomat or a negotiator or whatever it is you're trying to make me into. No, Collineth agreed. You are something more valuable. You are genuine, and that is why I am making you an offer. Daniel's stomach did a complicated flip. An offer? Come with us. When our delegation leaves Station Quintara 6, join us as a cultural liaison. Humans and Kellans working together, learning from each other. Your species has a gift for adaptation, for seeing connections others miss. We need that perspective. You want me to leave? Daniel looked around the observation deck, at the station that had been his home for the past 3 cycles. It was cramped, underpaid work, and half the people here didn't know his name. But it was familiar, safe, predictable. I want you to choose, Collineth corrected. The cubs have bonded with you. That will fade as they mature. But for now, separating them will cause distress. To them, and, I suspect, to you as well. Daniel looked down at Buttons, Kwesi, and Kuven, who were sitting in their usual formation, watching him with those enormous eyes. 3 tiny apex predators who'd decided a janitor was worth protecting. How much does this liaison thing pay? He asked, because he was still practical, even when his world was being turned upside down. Collineth named a figure that made Daniel's eyes widen. That's significantly more than I make mopping floors. You would have your own quarters on our vessel, access to Quellan educational resources, the opportunity to help bridge 2 species who need to understand each other better. Collineth paused. And you would not have to give up your blanket to keep warm. Daniel laughed, despite himself. You're really selling this, aren't you? I am merely presenting facts. The choice remains yours. The thing was, Daniel had spent most of his adult life feeling invisible. Just another maintenance worker keeping stations running while the important people did important things. He'd made peace with that, or thought he had. But standing here, with an ambassador of an apex predator species offering him a chance to be something more, to actually matter. It was terrifying. It was also tempting. Can I think about it? Daniel asked. Of course. We depart in 3 days. You have until then. Those 3 days were some of the strangest of Daniel's life. He toured the Quellan vessel, sleek, efficient, beautiful, in a way that spoke of a culture that valued both form and function. He met more cubs, saw how Quellan families operated, watched handlers teaching the young ones about their heritage and their place in the galaxy. He also talked to Bryn, who gave him advice he didn't expect. You've been cleaning floors for 3 cycles, Daniel, she said, sitting across from him in the station cafeteria. You're good at it, reliable. But I've watched you these past few weeks with those cubs. You light up in a way I've never seen before, like you found something that actually matters to you. They're just cubs, Daniel said weakly. They're a connection to something bigger than mopping floors and wondering if anyone notices you exist. Bryn smiled. Take the job, kid. See where it leads. You can always come back if it doesn't work out. The floors will still be here. That's not exactly encouraging. It's realistic, which is what you need right now. On the third day, Daniel stood outside his quarters one last time. The cubs were there, as always, waiting patiently. But this time, he wasn't wearing his maintenance uniform. He'd packed his few possessions, including his thermal blanket, and made his choice. "All right, Buttons," he said to Kumi, who chirped excitedly. "Let's see what happens when a janitor becomes a diplomat. This should be either amazing or a complete disaster." Kusi and Kuven added their own chirps of approval. Daniel boarded the Quellan vessel with 3 cubs at his heels, and absolutely no idea what he was doing, which, honestly, was pretty much how he'd lived his entire life. 6 months later, Daniel sat in a conference room watching Ambassador Kolneth negotiate a treaty with a species that had previously refused to even meet with Quellans. The cubs, now adolescents, growing into their predator heritage but still seeking Daniel out between their training sessions, lounged nearby. "You know what's wild?" Daniel said to Kumi during a break. "Cycles ago, I was mopping floors and thinking that was my entire future. Now I'm here, helping actual diplomacy happen because I gave you a blanket." Kumi, whose vocabulary had expanded significantly, made a sound that was almost like laughter. "Blanket," she said, in halting standard. "Warm, safe, you." "Yeah," Daniel said, scratching behind her ears like he had that first night. "I guess that's what it comes down to, huh? Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness." From across the room, Kolneth caught his eye and nodded approvingly. Daniel smiled. The galaxy was full of heroes, warriors, diplomats, scientists who changed the course of history with grand gestures and brilliant minds. But sometimes, just sometimes, the most important thing you could do was see someone in need and decide to help, even if it cost you your only blanket, even if it seemed insignificant, even if you were just a janitor who happened to care, because you never knew where that kindness might lead, or who might remember it, or how 3 baby apex predators might decide you were worth following into whatever came next. And honestly, Daniel wouldn't have it any other way.